Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're taking a pretty fascinating journey straight into the heart of criminology. We are going to tackle one massive, incredibly complex question. Why do people actually commit crimes? We're going to track how our understanding of this has evolved, going from ancient superstitions all the way up to modern behavioral science. So let's dive right in. Now, I know the word theory can sometimes sound a bit abstract or, let's be honest, maybe even a little dry. But in criminology, theories are far from boring. Think of it like this. Theories are the blueprints behind the buildings. Literally every single time a city hires more police officers to patrol a specific neighborhood, or say they fund a mentoring program for at-risk youth, they're acting on a criminological theory. These ideas actively shape our real-world laws, our justice system, and our everyday communities. So here's a quick roadmap for our explainer today. We'll be covering 1. The blueprints of policy. 2. The rational choice lens. 3. The biosocial lens. 4. The psychological lens. And finally, 5. Theory in action. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the blueprints of policy, and how we evaluate theories. For any theory to actually be effective, it needs a few key traits. First off, it has to be logically consistent, meaning its parts can't constantly contradict each other. It should also have a broad scope, so it can explain a wide range of behaviors. It needs to be parsimonious, which is really just a fancy academic way of saying it explains as much as possible with as few moving parts as possible. Critically, though, it must be testable and falsifiable. I mean, if it can't fail a test, it's just faith. It's not science. And finally, it absolutely must have practical utility to actually reduce crime in the real world. Moving right along to Section 2, the rational choice lens, looking at the history of these perspectives. For most of recorded human history, the world operated on a demonological perspective. People literally blamed crime on evil spirits. And as you can probably imagine, that led to some horrifying, totally arbitrary practices like trial by ordeal. But then, the 18th century Enlightenment changed the game entirely. The classical school came along and argued that human beings are actually rational creatures with free will. Suddenly, a crime wasn't the work of a ghost, it was a conscious choice. Fast forward a bit to the late 20th century, and this idea evolved into modern rational choice theory, which looks closely at how offenders respond to immediate, real-world opportunities. Consider this really brilliant concept from the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham. It's called the hedonistic calculus. Bentham basically believed that humans are fundamentally governed by pleasure and pain. So, before committing a crime, a person mentally weighs the expected rewards against the potential costs. If the rewards outweigh the risks, they go for it. Therefore, society just needs to adjust that math, making sure the punishments reliably exceed the gains. This one singular idea is pretty much the bedrock of our entire modern justice system. And this classical logic is what gave birth to deterrence theory, which generally takes two forms. First, you have specific deterrence. This focuses entirely on the individual, aiming to make the offender experience enough punishment that they literally never want to offend again. On the flip side, we have general deterrence. This one is all about making a public example out of the offender to discourage everyone else from even trying it. But notice how both of these rely on the exact same assumption, that potential offenders are rationally weighing the consequences. But modern criminology had to refine this a bit because, let's be honest with ourselves, people rarely do perfect cost-benefit math in their heads, right? Enter the concept of bounded rationality. Offenders are definitely making purposeful choices, but they're doing it under immense pressure, usually with very limited information. Think about it. A burglar isn't pulling out a chalkboard to calculate complex variables. They're just noticing a missing security camera, feeling the intense rush of time, and deciding in a split second if the immediate payoff is worth the risk. So if crime is a choice based on immediate opportunity, it stands to reason we can prevent it by simply changing the environment. This is known as situational crime prevention. We increase the effort by installing better locks, we increase the perceived risk by putting up bright lighting and cameras, and we reduce the rewards. A great example of this is when city buses implemented exact fare policies. Bus robberies famously plummeted overnight simply because there was no longer a pile of cash sitting there to steal. That is rational choice theory at work in our everyday lives. Now, that model works absolutely brilliantly for a planned burglary or a fraud scheme. But what about a crime of sudden, blinding rage? Or a crime driven by a severe mental crisis? It begs the question, what if crime isn't always a rational choice at all? Which brings us to Section 3, the biosocial lens, where we take a look inside the offender.
The early attempts at understanding the biology of crime were frankly a massive cautionary tale. Back in the 19th century, Cesare Lombroso pushed this idea of early positivism, famously claiming there were born criminals that you could literally identify just by looking at unusual skull shapes. It was deeply flawed, completely unscientific, and unfortunately used to justify some pretty terrible discrimination. We really have to contrast that dark history with modern biosocial criminology, which is rooted in rigorous science. Modern science absolutely does not claim that biology destines anyone to a life of crime. Instead, it studies how our biological factors interact with our social environments to influence our behavior.
For instance, researchers find that certain physical patterns of brain function, specifically those related to impulse control, are strongly associated with antisocial behavior. Believe it or not, they've even found that childhood exposure to environmental toxins like lead is directly linked to higher rates of aggression across entire populations. And while genetics definitely play a role, traits like impulsivity depend heavily on a person's environment to actually express themselves. The ultimate takeaway here is humility. Biology is a contributor, for sure, but it is never a destiny. A strong, supportive environment can completely neutralize a genetic risk.
Okay, so this brings us to a really fascinating next step. If the physical biology of the brain matters, how do our actual thought patterns, our emotions, and our psychological development drive offending behavior?
Let's jump into Section 4, the psychological lens and the inner roots of crime. Within the field of psychology, we usually look at three main traditions. First up is the psychodynamic tradition. This traces all the way back to Freud, and it looks at how unresolved early childhood conflicts end up shaping our later self-control. Second, we have the behavioral tradition, which argues that behavior is simply learned. Basically, we repeat actions that get rewarded, and we drop actions that get punished. And third is the cognitive tradition, which focuses heavily on how offenders process information. Research here shows that persistent offenders often have really distorted thinking patterns. For example, they might chronically blame others for their actions, or they might misread a totally neutral situation as being hostile. Now, before we move on, we have to pause and address a major misconception. Sourced directly from the American Psychological Association, most people with mental illness are not violent. In fact, they are far more likely to be victims of a crime than they are to be the offenders. While it's true that a very small subset of specific untreated conditions can elevate risk, responsible criminology requires us to completely reject the common myth that mental illness is the primary driver of crime.
All right, let's wrap things up with Section 5, Theory in Action, and see how all of this shapes public policy. Let's look at a very concrete finding from the National Institute of Justice. They found that people are significantly more deterred by a high certainty of getting caught than they are by the actual severity of the penalty itself. Think about it. Offenders almost always discount future costs. They just assume they'll get away with it. So having a highly visible, reliable police presence actually prevents far more crime than simply threatening someone with a massive, decades-long prison sentence. And this perfectly validates exactly what those classical thinkers were arguing centuries ago. Smart, certain enforcement works best. So this really brings our entire explainer into focus. A society's belief about why people offend totally dictates what it actually does about it. If a community leans heavily on the rational lens, their policy is going to rely on smart enforcement and deterrence. If they view crime through the biosocial lens, their policy naturally shifts toward public health, doing things like reducing lead exposure to stop crime way upstream. And if they primarily use the psychological lens, well, they're going to build cognitive behavioral treatment programs to help systematically reshape the distorted thinking of offenders. Because crime is just so incredibly complex, no single theory has all the answers. The most effective crime policy is almost always a blended approach of smart enforcement, public health initiatives, and psychological treatment. So I want to leave you with this final thought. If our laws and our programs are really just the blueprints of these criminological theories brought to life, which blueprint is your community using today? Next time you're out, take a look around your city. You might just see these theories playing out right in front of you. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.